All right, we'll do a few sum and difference identities with cosine. First problem, find the exact value of cosine negative 105. So again, I'm going to use my calculator. Help me out just a little bit. Use 45 again. So my 105, let's say minus 45. See what happens? So 60 and 45 added together gives me 105. So that's not what I want. So let's try the 105 plus 45. There's our 150. And so if we had 45 minus 150, 45 minus 150, there's our negative 105. So again, the strategy of using 45 really assists. So 45 minus 150. So cosine negative 105 is the same thing as cosine 45 minus 150, which means we'll be using our difference formula or difference identity. In this particular case, A is going to be 45, B is 150. So when we substitute everything in, there's our A, 45, cosine 150. Notice cosine, cosine. A then B, sine, sine. And if this is subtraction, this will be addition. So we're looking at 45 and 150. So let's see what our numbers are going to be. Well, again, 45, we should see consistently radical 2 over 2. What did we say? 150. There's our 150. 1/2 negative radical 3 over 2. All right, so 45. There's our radical 2 over 2. 150 negative radical 3 over 2. 45 radical 2 over 2. And 150 1/2. So we simplify that. There's our negative radical 6 over 4 and a positive radical 2 over 4. There's our answer. Negative radical 6 plus radical 2 or radical 2 minus radical 6, as long as the radical 6 is negative. Next problem. Find the exact value of cosine 165. So here, if we took the 165, then we subtract 45. There's our other value, 120. So 120 plus 45 equals 165. So the new problem, instead of cosine 165, cosine 120 plus the 45. We'll be using the sum identity for cosine. And again, because cosine is cosine, cosine, sine, sine. So in this case, A is going to be 120 and B is going to be 45. So let's substitute. So that'll be cosine 120, cosine 45, sine 120, cosine 45. So we know 45 is going to be the radical 2's over 2. So let's go check for 120. All right, 120, radical 3 over 2 for sine, negative 1/2 for cosine. So let's substitute. There's the negative 1/2 for cosine, and there's the radical 3 over 2 for sine. Of course, the 45s are both the radical 2's over 2. Simplify gives us a negative radical 2 over 4 and another negative radical 6 over 4. Put it together, there's our answer. Negative radical 2 minus radical 6 all over 4. Next problem, we'll use some radians now. Cosine negative pi over 12. So again, the value was for 45, for degrees, 3. Just to confirm, there's the 45 for degrees, 3 pi over 12 for radians. And so we've got negative 1 pi, for lack of better words. So I could do, we don't need this, say negative 1 plus 3. There's our 2. But 2 and 3, there we go, 2 minus the 3 will give us the negative 1. There's a 2 pi over 12 minus 3 pi over 12. So we'll be using our difference form instead of sum. And in this case, A will be pi over 6, because 2 pi over 12 reduces to pi over 6, and B is going to be pi over 4, because the 3 pi over 12 reduces to pi over 4. So we can take the original problem, cosine negative pi over 12, which is the same thing as 2 pi over 12 minus 3 pi over 12. we could either use these numbers or reduce it to pi over 6 and pi over 4. So when we put it out into the identity, we'll be looking at cosine and sine of pi over 6 and pi over 4. Pi over 4 we should know by now, that's our radical 2's over 2's. So let's confirm the pi over 6. Pi over 6, which is 30 degrees, is the 1/2 and the radical 3 over 2. So let's substitute everything in. There's the radical 3 over 2 for cosine. Of course, the radical 2 over 2 for pi over 4. And the 1/2 for sine. Simplify, that'll give us radical 6 over 4. This will give us radical 2 over 4. There's our answer. Radical 6 plus radical 2 all over 4. All right, one more problem. Find the cosine 5 pi over 12. And again, if we took 3 from 5, that'll give us the 2. So those are our two values. 2 pi over 12 plus the 3 pi over 12 gives us the 5 pi over 12. So we'll be using the sum identity. That's cosine, cosine, sine, sine. Because this was addition, the sign should be different. That's why that's subtraction. So in this case, we'll be using pi over 6, which is 2 pi over 12 reduced, and pi over 4, which is the 3 pi over 12 reduced. So that means the original problem, cosine 5 pi over 12, can be rewritten as the sum, 2 pi over 12 and 3 pi over 12, all could be reduced to the pi over 6 and the pi over 4. Again, whichever values you choose to use, whether it be the green ones or the purple ones. So when we substitute the values in, there's a pi over 6, pi over 4, pi over 6, pi over 4. Pi's over 4, we're going to know those are the radical 2's over 2. And pi over 6 we just did in the previous problem, which was the 1/2 and the radical 3 over 2. So when we substitute, there's the cosine, radical 3 over 2. That's my radical 2 over 2 minus, there's the 1/2, radical 2 over 2. Simplify, radical 6 over 4 and radical 2 over 4. There's our answer, radical 6 minus radical 2 all over 4. All right, now you have a few independent problems to do.